All right, welcome back to Beach Chair Chats. I'm Brian Kaiser here on a Monday of all favorite days of the week, is everyone's favorite day is Monday. But I'm here with Josh Wagman. How are you today, Josh?
I'm doing fantastic.
Besides it being early, because you're out there, you said Idaho, so I've never been there. What's it like in Idaho?
Idaho actually does not suck. And so most people have this conception that it's just potato farms and stuff because on the license plates it says famous potatoes. But are there really any potatoes in Idaho? No, they're shipped elsewhere throughout
Yeah.
the nation. And right outside of Boise, Idaho, where I live, it's just a really nice
Hmm.
suburban community, very active, lots of trails, very people are pretty kind overall.
Hmm.
And that's a nice thing. And so, anyway, Idaho's great, and it still remains one of, I think, the best kept secrets in our country. But I'm spilling the beans today.
Well, because I think people get obsessed with like Montana because it's like the neighbor. Because let's go to Bozeman, let's go to Montana. It's beautiful, but Idaho's like right there. I would assume
Yeah.
the continuation of the scenery and just everything with it
Yep.
is
Yep.
there. So, but no one thinks about Idaho except when they get like Boise State and a blue football field turf. I mean,
Right.
it's just part of the deal. So you are a doctor. You work with, let's see, disturb Alzheimer's and cholesterol. That's what.
Yeah, so I like to say I'm not a real doctor. You don't call the PhD, when somebody's having a cardiac event, but
No.
I try to teach people how to avoid cardiac events. And
Yes.
so yeah, I mean I have multiple doctoral degrees actually, but I'm not
Hmm.
a physician per
Hmm.
se. So I have a doctorate in physical therapy and I have a PhD studying cholesterol disturbances and Alzheimer's disease.
Hmm.
Clinically, I went to the Yale School of Medicine for PA school.
Yeah.
And so basically, when I go to, I typically don't get invited to dinner parties because what
Hmm.
kind of party would this be? I mean, people want to actually do normal people things. But if I ever
Yes.
did get invited to a dinner party, I basically would say, I have very few useful skills except going to school and taking tests. But what I try to do is I try to help clinicians, non-clinicians, anyone not have heart attack, strokes, and
Hmm.
dementia. And there are a lot of things that go into that. But what I try to do is relate that in a way that people can actually understand and still be my friends so that we can get there together rather than people just running away from the guy who's saying all sorts of esoteric things.
Yeah. Well, cholesterol is those, as a person who has, I'll admit it, high cholesterol. I did it at one point in my life when I used to run marathons. I was very healthy, trying to get back into it because it is a thing, right? It's real. And I think a lot of people do suffer from high cholesterol, which could have, long-term effects that could have negative consequences. So what inspired you to get into this work? What led you down this path to say, I want to do this for a living and study this?
Yeah, so what's funny about this is in Proverbs it says the heart of man plans his ways, but the Lord establishes his steps. And I think that means that you think you're going to do something and God laughs and then puts you on a different path. And so when I was in grad school the first time, this was physical therapy school, I got really, really sick.
Hmm.
And nobody could really figure out what was going on. And I was a Division I athlete, and then I went from clicking off 430 miles over and over and over to not being able to go up a flight of steps. And that was
Yeah.
pretty bad. But God used that to catalyze what I was supposed to do when I grew up. And because I was in trying to figure out what was going on with me, I became entrenched in endocrinology and biochemistry. And I was like, wow, this stuff's really, really cool.
Hmm.
And so I finished PT school and I practiced clinically as a physical therapist for years, which is wonderful. But there was never a sense of finality that I was done there. So I went back to the Yale School of Medicine. Then I actually did a PhD later just because I can't help myself. But anyway, but what really specifically got me into lipids is kind of funny. I wish I had a strong humanitarian reason for it, but I was sitting there on a dark January morning, and I'm always reading stuff. I voraciously read everything, whether it be the Journal of Clinical Lipidology or The Catcher in the Rye, and I do like interval training between classic novels and various other clinical documents. And anyway, so I'm reading something because I had a patient cancel and there was this article, and it had some obnoxiously condescending title like Basics of Lipids and Lipoproteins. I'm like, okay, how hard can this be, right?
Hmm.
I'm pretty good at biochemistry, I thought. And so I open up this what's supposed to be a rudimentary review of cholesterol homeostasis, and I barely understood any of it. And I was like, well, that's stupid. And so I thought that was unacceptable. And so I said, I'm going to invest myself in learning everything there is to know about this. And are you ever going to know everything about any topic? Heck no. But in the process of trying and inevitably failing, you learn a bunch of stuff. And hopefully, with what you've learned along the way, you're able to help people with what you have gleaned. And so that's what created this monster as far as being an unequivocal lipid geek. But hey, I think it's been a fun ride. And if you would have told me when I was 18 that, oh yeah, Josh, you're gonna be a lipid specialist, I'd be like, what does that even mean? You know,
Yeah,
and
what is
I
lipids?
just like, come on, what, come on. So anyway, it's really, really kind of interesting how it all shakes out.
Well, I think it's fascinating too. You made this comment about when you were going through it, right? You said you're running, you do this, all of a sudden now you can't go up a flight of stairs. So you start to investigate this because of from a personal matter. I work in higher education. I work with students all the time. When I go in healthcare, is like when I ask them the question, is it what inspired you to do it? And typically it is a personal reason. Either they've experienced something from a healthcare crisis or family. So for you, it's a perfect story. So how do you take this information that you've learned and all your education, stuff that you've done to put it to practice and help people? What are some of the concerns that people bring to you that you can help guide them, give them some tips to just live a healthier lifestyle?
Yeah, yeah. So actually, why I wrote the book, and so my book's called The Home Security System in the Lipid Neighborhood.
Hmm.
And so I say I try to bring clarity and hilarity to cardiovascular disease and cholesterol, which is a historically contentious, controversial, and misunderstood topic.
Hmm.
And so I've seen, thousands of patients, and I was trying to help them better understand all the factors that could result in them having cardiovascular disease and what we were going to try to do to not have cardiovascular disease, heart attacks, strokes, down the line dementia. And so people learn pretty well through metaphors usually. And I started using these metaphors and I just kind of came up with them and I was using them with my patients. And my patients seemed to get it and they at least were still pretending to be my friend. And my adherence was really, really high. And that's really good because when you have a recommendation for somebody with their life, your goal is the same as theirs. You both want to live well and you both want to avoid these life-changing, game-changing, terrible events that could otherwise happen. And so, but a good reason to do whatever you're doing is not because my doctor said this, and a good reason to recommend something is not because I'm a doctor or I have this credential and beat people over the head with your truth hammer.
Hmm.
It's best if you get there together. And if you can walk there together and there can be an understanding on the part of the patient with what you're doing, and you have good, strong rationales from a biochemical standpoint and otherwise, and clinical data standpoint, then hey, you're gonna all do that together. And there's gonna be better buy-in on the part of the patient, and then everybody wins. And so that's really what I wanted. And I also teach lipid physiology across the country and a lot of my students too. I would teach this to my students and people over the years we're like, dude, you just gotta write a book. You gotta write a book.
Hmm.
And because I try not to be boring with my shoes or my rhetoric. I'm the guy who wears a suit and then has running shoes on at all the
Hmm.
conferences. And so people are like, okay, this is pretty good. We're enjoying this, we're understanding this, and you should write a book. You should write a book. And enough people told me I should write a book, I eventually did. And
Hmm.
so that's what has come out of this. And it's writing books is an interesting process, but it's been a blessing, and when there have been a few medical programs and also just medical practices that have bought it in bulk for their patients, particularly the ones who are really interested in the process, which I think we all should be. And they give it to their patients as a resource, and that's really neat, and that's really gratifying for me to be able to see. And so, what I say is, for everybody who does not want to have heart attacks, strokes, and down the line dementia, I want you to have a great metabolic home security system, and I want you to live in a safe lipid neighborhood. Your home security system has four basic pillars: normal blood sugar, normal blood pressure, keep inflammation low, don't smoke or do drugs. Those are the axioms. Okay. There are
Hmm.
very few things in biology that are binary, but you can take those to the bank. Nobody's New Year's resolution is to be more insulin resistant. Nobody ever says, I wish I was more inflamed. That would make life better. And it's
Yes.
Monday. This is not a good day to start smoking. So
Yes.
these are axioms: normal blood sugar, normal blood pressure, keep inflammation low, don't smoke. But then Your lipid neighborhood, that's your cholesterol panel. Because every ApoB containing particle, the vast majority of those being LDL particles, are potentially, not necessarily, but potentially criminals that can infiltrate your arterial abode. And then the LP little a particles, those are potential felons that, if you pick the wrong parents, can be about 6.5 times as likely to cause mischief than your run of the mill LDL particle. Okay, so how's your home security system? You're always going to be checking that. How's your lipid neighborhood? Well, it can look like you're living in a rough inner city neighborhood on paper with your cholesterol panel, but people don't live on paper.
Hmm.
And so, do we have better ways, especially in midlife, to inform our decision making process when it comes to your lipid neighborhood? We do. And so, one of my catchphrases is got plaque, get a CAC. What's a CAC? Coronary artery calcium score. I call it the colonoscopy of the heart without the nasty pregame show because, unlike a bowel prep for a colonoscopy, which, if anyone listening has had those will
Hmm.
temporarily ruin your social life and destroy your bathroom. This low dose CT scan, about the same amount as a mammogram, you lay down and it shows if you have calcified plaque in your coronaries, which
Hmm.
is a late finding in the disease process. And so, if you have a CAC score above zero, it means there's been a break in. Well, given that a cholesterol laden perpetrator broke in, do you want to keep living in the same rough lipid neighborhood where you got broken into? Or do you maybe want to consider moving to a nice, safe, gated community with fewer lipid criminals? That would seem appropriate. So, anyway, so that's kind of the basis. And then we unpack the purpose of these particles and all the things that go into having cardiovascular disease and the things and the tools that we have to mitigate that progression. And so, anyway, so it's not just a good or bad. People want it to be easy or just plug it into a risk calculator or an algorithm. It's more complicated than that. So that's why I have to write books about it. And this is why all
Hmm.
my patient appointments would take 2 hours and I made $14 an hour with no benefits in clinical practice. But hey, it's worth it, right? People are worth it. And knowledge is power, and even at really, really good medical programs, historically all we've been taught is LDL bad, HDL good, everybody take a statin, and let's move on to simpler topics. But I
Hmm.
think it's actually worth investing some more time and bandwidth into, given that this is the number one killer of people across the globe. And so that's why I do what I do, man.
Do you start to see this, these real concerns, right, with health becoming more prevalent now at the younger ages, right? Because typically, I mean, I don't know much about cardiovascular health, cholesterol. I just know my own numbers. Um, do you see it becoming more concerning for even younger generations? You know, your 20-year-olds, 30-year-olds, or when do you typically start to see like this is becoming a concern, or do you see it becoming more prevalent at people with younger ages?
Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of this is just because of just the lack of metabolic health as far as insulin resistance in our country, and you see kids walking down the street and drinking, soda and all these
Hmm.
things. Actually, they're probably not walking down the street. They're probably sitting there drinking a soda more
Yeah.
likely. And so, and there's this thought called primordial prevention, given that even when they've done autopsies of soldiers that have died in war, unfortunately, they have fatty streaks, which is the beginning of
Hmm.
the atherosclerosis process just on autopsies. And so this phenomenon, atherosclerosis, is typically something that starts early on in life and can progress, but there are multiple factors that result in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And so I think that regardless, knowing your numbers, knowing the genetic risk factors that go into these things, but one of my mantras is control your insulin, control your life, because insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia, with or without hyperglycemia, drives a lot of chronic disease in our country. And if we can, all throughout our lifespan, do what we can to not be insulin resistant, then I think that's going to set us up for better success, no matter what your lipid neighborhood is. That said, you can pick the wrong parents and people can get broken into even if they aren't insulin resistant. And so it's good to know all these things. There are multiple things that contribute to the process. Although you cannot have plaque in your coronaries without one of these ApoB particles, which most of the time are LDL particles, infiltrating your arterial abode. How it got there is another story. And so I think it's important to just evaluate all the things. And I've been highly critical of risk calculators because a lot of times, healthcare professionals will plug in your numbers that they got on a blood panel and your blood pressure and your age and things into a 10-year risk calculator. And now there's a 30-year risk calculator as well. And then the computer spits out percentages, and then that's supposed to tell you what to do or not do. That's unacceptable. Understanding the individual utility of each biomarker and the diagnostic images you have and all those other things is way more important than just the constellation of all the things vomited back out on your computer screen. And so, since there's, a lot to know, that's why we have to write books about this. And I think that
Hmm.
that starts with our didactic programs and actually investing time in prevention. Because Western medicine is historically very, very good at reacting and
Hmm.
very, very poor at preventing. And what I try to do is I try to get people excited about prevention and shift the paradigm from reactionary to one of being preventive. And that starts early. And really we can take those measures. And most of the time people are like, oh, this guy doesn't know anything when I tell you that the solution is sleep, move, don't eat crap, lather,
Hmm.
rinse, repeat,
Yeah, pretty
every
much.
day of your life. But ultimately, and what does that mean? We can be more specific about that and giving people structure with those things. But that's pretty good stuff. And then we need to know some of our other risk factors and some of our genetic predispositions too, because some people have more or less margin for error depending on the parents they picked, especially when it comes to the lipid neighborhood.
Yeah, you're right about the reactiveness of Western medicine. Like I just went to my cardiologist recently because I figured, I'm in my age or where I'm at and getting a little bit older and just want to double check on some things. And the first thing is like, well, we're gonna do this stress test. We're gonna go through the box checks. Like stress test, do this, maybe put you on some medical treatment. It's like, but is there a solution, that I don't have to go on medication? Someone at my age, I'm 46. I don't know how old you are, but I think I might have some years on you. Maybe. I don't know.
A few. I'll be 40 this year.
See, you're catching up to the club. All right. It's a good
Yeah,
club to be in. All right.
you're
And
right.
there's nothing wrong with the 40s. But how you take care of yourself, I will say when I go back to my previous, like I was really good health, right? And you're probably in great shape, probably great health. You probably run, like you said, you're running. You probably still do run often. How do you get someone who's maybe was at that point in their life, great health, great shape, great cholesterol, all the markers are hitting, and then they go through a period where they don't. How do you get them to get back on track?
Yeah,
Was
yeah. And you always meet people where they're at, right? And there are
mm,
many factors. And what's encouraging to me with what you said is somebody actually has that history of being active and pulling the levers that comes to actually having a great metabolic home security system and all the things. And so that you did it before is encouraging because if you did it before, yeah, you can do it again. It takes some doing to get there, but not to try to get back there all at once. And a lot of us, and I was a Division I athlete. I'm far from that now. And I coach cross country and track now, and I'm the really old coach that's still fast for an old guy, which is hilarious. And so, but and that's where you have arrived at a special place in the world when if you don't completely physically fall apart, you're irrelevant for many years until you're like 40, and then it's like, oh yeah, for an old guy, he's actually
like,
pretty good, which is funny.
it is
But
funny,
but
yes.
really, I mean, the thing is you've done it before, and there are various situations that have resulted in you not doing that right now. However, don't expect yourself to be what you were when you were doing it, and that's a reality for me every day. I do
Humble.
the same things I've always done. I'm just worse at it and it hurts more after.
Hmm.
And so, you have to just temper your expectations. And a lot of times, and especially I feel like this is more common with guys from my experience, from my clinical experience is it's like, well, if I can't do what I used to, I'm just not going to do it at all. It's kind of
Hmm.
an all or nothing approach.
Yes.
And no, I mean, and that's the thing. And so don't expect yourself to be what you were when you're 20. And if you are honestly in the prime of your physical health when you're in your 40s, you weren't doing what you should have done when you were 20 is the reality. But
Yeah.
hey, there's the thing. You can be very, very healthy and you can be crushing it at life and you can still be having fun and you can be fast for an old guy, which is where I'm at, if you are pulling those levers. Additionally, you have to just ask people what their goals are. And most people, they need to have a reason outside themselves. And so and it has to usually go beyond, oh, I just don't want to have heart attack. Well, that's pretty remote for people who haven't had one. It's just like,
Hmm.
I can't really visualize that. The dementia conversation usually gets people a little more fired up, but also that's many years out in the future, and people think that they can just punt into some nebulous tomorrow. And so, but what you ask people is, okay, well, do you have kids? Do you have grandkids? Do you want to be able to run around with them? Do you want to be guy at your graduation that everybody thinks is their great grandfather, even though you're your dad, probably not. And so, just finding what matters to people is important in order to help catalyze some sort of behavior change. And then another thing too is the one test that I mentioned, the CAC, that coronary artery calcium score. I mean, that just shows, hey, you actually have, if you have a score above zero, you have disease, you have plaque in your coronaries. Oh,
Hmm.
okay. Well, do you want that plaque stable or unstable? Do we have ways to actually stabilize that plaque if you've got some and even regress that plaque? We do, but we can't do it just sitting around. And so those are really strong motivators, I think, beyond just, oh, your blood work looks good. Well, what do you do? Most people don't really care. I mean, actually, a lot. It is interesting in my clinical experience. A lot of the gals, will their LDL cholesterol will go from like 75 to 78, and they'll be like, "Oh my goodness, what did I do?" And it's like that's just that it didn't change at all. So,
No.
but guys are like, "Yeah, whatever," and they won't go to you until they're dying. And so, it's important to just be able to meet people where they're at.
Hmm.
And honestly, a lot of this stuff is just the human psychology element of it all. But at the end of the day, we all want to live well,
Hmm.
and we want to not only hopefully add some years to our life, but add life to our years in the process.
But I think you're right about too when people don't show up for help until they need it, right? Something happened, an experience this, they had a health risk or health concern, and now they're showing up to do this. When in reality, if you start these practices early, you can do a lot of preventative work, have a good quality of life. But also, even like you have this relationship with dementia, right? Alzheimer's and dementia. What have you noticed about the relationship between this and those diseases?
Yeah, so in general, and there's a lot to this. In general, what's good for the heart is good for the brain. And so exercise, if it was a drug, it would be a miracle pill associated with a 45% reduced risk of dementia. People in the highest cardiorespiratory fitness, and nobody ever said, boy, I wish I was less aerobically fit. And, nobody ever said, boy, I wish I was weaker too. Heavyweights aren't going to pick themselves up either. And so all these things are important, but the people in the highest cardiorespiratory fitness levels have the lowest incidence of dementia. Okay, that makes sense. And then midlife obesity associated with a nearly fourfold risk of Alzheimer's disease. And then people who have coronary disease in midlife, that's associated with dementia. And then people who have diabetes, that is associated with about a 56% increased risk of dementia. So all these things make sense. Like, okay, yeah, diabetes is bad, obesity, not
Hmm.
great. Yeah, all these things make sense. But there are some peculiarities too when it comes to cholesterol in the brain, and it's kept siloed from the rest of the body for a reason, and it's very, very, very complicated there. But one of the reasons that I got into it too is because my grandmother passed away from complications due to Alzheimer's disease, and there's a big
Mine
difference
too.
between living and existing. And so for as long as God keeps you around, you want to be crushing it and then be done. You don't want to have this protracted and super, super terrible demise where you're not even you anymore. And
Hmm.
my wife actually has one risk factor. So there are a lot of factors that result in someone progressing to neurodegenerative disease, Alzheimer's disease. But most of these things aren't deterministic. Outside of some really, really rare, terrible, terrible diseases, these genes aren't deterministic. Your genes aren't your destiny. They just give you more or less margin for error. And so the most common risk factor, and I won't go into a huge diatribe on this because honestly, this kind of deserves its own full conversation because it's such a loaded topic. But
Hmm.
there's something called ApoE, and specifically ApoE4. And this has gained some popularity, mainstream popularity, because Chris Hemsworth, is Thor, and I call it
Hmm.
ApoE Thor because he has two copies of this gene called ApoE4. You get one ApoE gene from mom, one from dad. Most people have two copies of ApoE3, but if you have one copy of this ApoE4, you have maybe a 2 to 3 fold risk of getting Alzheimer's disease. If you have two copies of ApoE4, which Chris Hemsworth does, then it maybe goes up to 8 to 12 fold. However, if you pull the right levers, I don't think you necessarily do get Alzheimer's disease. You just can't let fire start because your fire department isn't very good, so to speak.
Yeah.
So anyway, so this is all there, and there's a lot of stuff that goes into there, but really that is kind of the next frontier, I think. And yes, we can do a pretty darn good job with the tools we have and the risk stratification techniques we have below the brain, which is great because it's all related. However, I think that we'll be able to actually have more individualized precision approaches, particularly as our blood-based biomarkers are getting better and correlating better with what we see on cerebrospinal fluid taps and some of the things that we've ascertained from postmortem studies, because people aren't just lining up to get their brains biopsied and get cerebrospinal fluid taps, which is crazy, right? You know, people are
Mhm.
selfish.
Yeah.
But no, but
Why
really,
would not?
as we have as we have better data and broader data sets, it's an exciting thing for me because I think we'll be able to say, ooh, this intervention for you might be best given your context versus this might be a little different for you, depending on the milieu that's going on in the central nervous system. And that's super, super exciting to me.
Well, it's everything goes in. Like I said, take care of your heart, right? Is important because it takes care of your mind and runs everything. And if it's just these are just basic things, right? Talk about movement, you talk about sleep, just eating well. Yeah, it's practical, but I think a lot of people just struggle with it because
Yeah.
of the world we live in, the convenience of food, right? I think about my own son and the elements of DoorDash, and you're right about the sugar thing. I'm like, I get on them, like, gotta work on this. And it's this convenient and like the addictiveness of sugar. I mean, I used to run with a cardiologist back in Nebraska, and he was always on runs, like doing all this stuff. I'm like, hey doc, really? So, but it's a funny story. Speaking of that, because this guy he lost a bunch of weight to run a, it's a fun story. Run a marathon. He's like, I want to go vegan. So he did. Just randomly changed his diet, and I remember him running this. He was like pale white, super thin, and he showed up at the race, and it's like, geez, this is like, I'm just dying here. Like, and after the race, he finished it. We're in Sioux Falls, South Dakota for this thing, and then the next day, he's like started to eat. His diet changed to put weight back on, and guess what his diet was? What do you think his diet might have been? Cardiologist.
I mean, he just went off the rails, probably. I don't know.
Two beers and a pizza. It's like, dude,
Yeah, yeah, there you
okay,
go.
you're a
Yeah.
cardiologist, man.
Uh-huh.
Sometimes runners do some crazy stuff, but we try to take care of ourselves. We try to take care of our health, but there's so much stuff. I'm like, that's a whole nother conversation. We talk about food and eat and
Hmm.
society and all these different types of pressures that
Yeah.
affect us, stress that affect the heart, things that are all there. And it's like, I think the basic premonition or premise of this is that movement, you know, eating well and trying to sleep are three things I've taken away. I hope they can do those same things as well because I don't sleep well at all because I just don't. Um, Getting better about food, also getting well movement. So hopefully I start to see these results change for
Yeah.
myself and maybe other people will be inspired by this too. So you coach also, let me just digress, you coach cross country and track, right? What's that like?
Yep. Yeah.
High school
That's
or college? High school?
high school. High school. Yeah. And so, no, I coach at my daughter goes to the elementary campus of this private school, and I coach at the high school, and that's been a huge blessing.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, you keep moving, you stay young, and hopefully you hang out with some kids, and that helps keep you young too. And so just helping them, I have no delusions of ever being, you know, good anymore or something like that, which is great, and but now I get to help them be the best they can be, and that's super rewarding, and I really you love that and very blessed to do that. It's probably the favorite thing I've got going on in life. And I got lots of stuff going on and
Mm-hmm.
I'm very blessed to have many opportunities, but that's good stuff. And occasionally, some of the kids will ask a question about, lipid biochemistry on runs. And when you're running the foothills for an hour, you got lots of
You got a lot to
time.
talk about.
And so it's like buckle up, man, and then
Mm-hmm.
we can have some fun talks there. And I think some of them at least pretend to think it's sort of interesting. So that's cool.
Well, you get them while they're young, but it's good to have balance too. I think this is important. Other message as well, because as working professionals, I think we get stuck in these things. We do our work, but giving back as something like cross country coach to help teach, help inspire, help coach kids to be the best they can be. But I always like to find the fascinating part about aging, because you said you're going to be 40, classified quote unquote old, not old. I remember when Derek Jeter retired, he says, I'm now young again. I'm not a Yankees fan, but I do appreciate the statement when he retired from baseball. It's like, I'm now officially young because he was, you're old, you're washed up, you're not good anymore. The nice thing about running is when you change age groups, it starts all over, right?
Oh
So
yeah.
start your PR clock at the age group where you're
Yep.
at, and then you can have
Yep.
new goals and you don't have to worry about what it was 20 years ago as well. But Josh, it's been wonderful having you on today. I learned a lot about this. that more than I even knew. Now I like want to Google a lot of these things too, just to kind of understand more about my health. And hopefully others that listen to this will find some fascination with it too, that they also start to take care of their health as well before it gets to be too late and then they can't reverse it as easy as we hoped. But Josh,
Yeah, I
it's
know, and
been
that's what we want for
well,
sure.
it's been wonderful. Someday if I ever get up to the great state up there in the Northwest to Idaho, check it out up there someday. No beaches up there though. It's a beach chair chat, unless there's a lake.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Lucky Peak Reservoir, that's sort of a beach, but yeah, that doesn't count. And so
It's somewhere with body
anyway,
water, yeah.
yeah, right. And so in the picture, I love the name of the podcast here, and there's a picture
Yeah.
of me running on a beach in San Diego with my daughter, and
Mm-hmm.
that's one of my favorites, just because running's the best, beaches are the best.
Yeah, they
When you're
are.
with the people you love, that's the best, and I think that gives us all a little foreshadowing at heaven right there. So I
Well,
love that.
yeah, that's why I came up with this. And I wasn't sure what to call this thing. I've been sitting on this for 2 years. This idea of doing a podcast and didn't know what it would be, right? But I found a title that didn't was not taken either, which is great. But I love the beach, I love the ocean because there's a sense of freedom, the sense of, like you said, close to heaven, like the feeling of I call it my sanctuary, whether I go to church or not. I go for the most peace and the most closeness to anything divine I find there. And so there's something wonderful about that. But I give you props to run on the beach because if I run on the beach, my back is just you talk plaque and cack, my back is out of whack if I'm running on a beach, right? So it's brutal, but I'm hurting if I make it a quarter mile, because that's what happens when you get in your 40s, Josh.
Yeah,
Just wait for it. But enjoy the running. It's been a pleasure having you on today, and enjoy that time out there. I know it's early, not for me. It's going to be almost lunchtime before I know it. So, but it's been a pleasure having you on, and thanks for being here today.
yeah. Thanks so much for having me, man.